The year was 1876, and the desert stretched wide as judgment. The sun hung low and merciless, a molten coin tossed across the horizon, its glare bleaching the bones of cattle long dead by the roadside. Heat shimmered like fever in the air, and from its wavering haze emerged a woman, small, steady, and nearly spent. Her name was Nina May Calloway, though she hadn't spoken it in days. The dust had taken her voice, and the world had taken everything else. She walked with her head high, though her shadow wavered. Her dress, once soft blue, was the color of clay now, torn where the rocks had claimed it. A brass locket swung against her collarbone, the only sound besides her boots dragging through grit. When she reached the sign that marked the edge of Dust Haven, she paused. The words welcome, stranger were nearly hidden under layers of sand. The irony did not escape her. The town shimmered ahead, wooden porches, a crooked church steeple, the faint clatter of wagons. She entered like someone crossing into a dream that might vanish if she blinked. Men outside the saloon straightened, their eyes following her with the casual cruelty of those who have never gone hungry. She passed them without a word. Inside the general store, the air smelled of flour, leather, and indifference. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice thin but steady. The shopkeeper, a stout woman with eyes like dry gravel, looked her up and down. "Ain't much call for strangers. You from the east?" Nina hesitated. "Farther." That was answer enough. The woman shook her head. "Try the laundry. Or the saloon if you ain't proud." Nina thanked her and stepped back into the street. The wind rose, curling the hem of her skirt, carrying whispers from the porches. "Pretty thing for a beggar. Looks like trouble come walking. Another lost soul." By sundown, she'd been turned away from every door. She sat on the steps of the shuttered post office, the sky bleeding red above her, and thought of the city she'd fled, of a man's hands that bruised and a promise that broke like glass. She pressed the locket to her lips and closed her eyes. From behind her came laughter. Two men from the saloon swaggered past, their boots kicking up dust. "Here tell old Whitlow's needin' a maid," one said. "If she's desperate, that mountain fool might take her in." The other spat. "Ain't no woman climbed that ridge and come back sane." Nina turned toward the mountains. They rose black and sharp against the dying light, their slopes veiled in pine and rumor. A maid, they'd said. A place to stay. It was enough. She began walking before she could talk herself out of it. The path twisted steeply upward, the ground dry and treacherous. Sagebrush scratched her legs, stones slipped underfoot. By the time the moon rose, her breath came ragged, her palms were cut, and her body shook with exhaustion. But she kept climbing. Some part of her, the stubborn ember that hunger and shame had not yet extinguished, refused to stop. When she finally saw smoke curling above the trees, relief nearly brought her to her knees. She followed it to a clearing where a cabin stood, square and solid beneath the pines. Light glowed faintly through the window. She hesitated, heart hammering, then raised her hand and knocked. The door opened slowly, and a man filled its frame. He was tall, broad-shouldered, sunburnt, with eyes like storm clouds before rain. His shirt was half unbuttoned, his forearms dark with work. Silence hung between them, thick as the heat. "I was told you need a maid," Nina said. Her voice wavered, but her gaze did not. "And I need a shelter." He studied her as if weighing her honesty against the night. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. Inside, the cabin was rough but clean. A fire smoldered in the hearth, the scent of wood smoke mingling with pine. She stood uncertainly near the door, hands clasped before her. He filled a tin cup with water and handed it to her. She drank too quickly, coughing, and he waited without judgment until she caught her breath. "I can clean," she said. "Cook some. I'll earn what I take." He nodded once. "Stay then." His voice was low, unused, carrying the gravel of solitude. Days passed. She worked without asking what was expected. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows until they let the light back in. He repaired the fence, brought in wood, and spoke only when necessary. Yet his quiet held no cruelty, only a kind of restraint, like someone guarding what little peace he owned. At night, Nina listened to the wind breathing through the eaves. Sometimes she hummed the lullabies her mother once sang, soft songs meant to keep loneliness at bay. Once, she caught him listening from the doorway, his expression unreadable, his rough hands still as stone. He didn't speak, but the next morning there were fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table. When storms rolled through the mountains, thunder shaking the walls, she flinched. One evening, lightning cracked so close that the window pane rattled, and she sank to the floor by the hearth, arms around her knees. John, she'd learned his name by then, appeared beside her wordless. He set a lantern between them, its glow soft and steady, and sat down across from her. The storm raged, but his presence steadied her more than the light. She stared at the flame until the sound of rain dulled to a hush, then whispered, "You don't mind me being here?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Mind the silence less when you're in it." It was the closest thing to tenderness either had offered. But peace, like mercy, never lasts long in a town built on gossip. When John went down to Dust Haven for supplies, the whispers followed him. "Keeps her up there like a wife. Ain't fit, a man living with a drifter." He ignored them, but each word clung to him like soot. He returned late, shoulders heavy, the scent of rain and bitterness clinging to his coat. Nina saw it in his eyes before he spoke. "They talk," he said simply. She turned from a fire. "They always do." "They'll drive you off again," he muttered. "I've nowhere left to go." The silence between them stretched. She could feel the distance growing, not from lack of kindness, but from shame neither had earned. At last she said, "If it shames you to have me here, I'll leave." He looked up sharply. No, the word hung like a vow, rough and certain. The next morning, he was gone before dawn, working the fence, splitting wood with a violence that spoke of fury restrained. From a porch, she watched him through the rising mist, his body moving with rhythm and rage. Then she turned back to the cabin and began to bake bread. The smell drifted across the clearing, warm and sweet, a peace offering wrapped in quiet defiance. When he returned, sweat darkening his shirt, she met his eyes. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to that small kitchen, the table between them, the scent of bread and forgiveness. He took a piece, broke it, and handed half to her. They ate in silence. Outside, the sun sank behind the mountains, setting the sky aflame. Somewhere below, in Dust Haven, a church bell rang, a distant, hollow sound that might have been warning or blessing. John glanced toward the valley, his jaw tight. "They won't forget," he said. Nina brushed the crumbs from her palm. "Then let them remember." The fire popped, a single ember leaping upward like a spark of defiance. She followed its rise until it vanished into the dark, her heart steady for the first time since she'd arrived. Yet as the wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of laughter from the town below, she felt it again, the fragile peace, trembling in the balance, waiting to be tested. Autumn arrived with a whisper, carrying the scent of pine smoke and endings. The mountains blushed gold, and the air grew crisp enough to bite. In that small clearing beneath the aspen trees, Nina and John moved through their days with quiet rhythm, mending fences, gathering apples, rebuilding what peace they had carved from the wild. Yet under the calm, a weight pressed against them, the town's judgment sharp as frost. Dust Haven had not forgotten the drifter woman or the man who gave her shelter. John felt it whenever he rode down the ridge, eyes watching, tongues whispering behind palms. "Ain't right, a woman like that living with no ring." The words clung to him like smoke. He bore them without answer, but silence, too, can bruise. When he returned home, his voice was shorter, his gaze distant. Nina noticed the change and said nothing. She knew the shape of shame and how it eats a person from within. The harvest festival came at October's end, when lanterns hung like low stars above the main street. Music spilled from the saloon, rough and eager. John had avoided the festival for years, but this time Nina asked him to take her. "Let them see," she said, smoothing her dress, her hands trembling slightly. "Let them see we're not hiding." He hesitated, then offered his arm. "Let them look, then." They walked into town at dusk. The crowd parted around them, chatter faltering like wind against stone. Nina's white dress caught the lantern light, simple but proud, and for a moment she felt almost unafraid. Then came the whispers, soft at first, then louder, swelling like a tide. There she is. Mountain Witch. Bought herself a husband with pity. Martha Claymore stood near the pie table, her lips curling into the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Well now," she said, voice honeyed and cruel, "if it isn't the maid and her master." The laughter that followed was small but cutting. Nina froze. John's jaw tightened. He turned toward Martha, but she didn't flinch. The air trembled, every eye fixed on them. Instead of speaking, he reached for Nina's hand, dirty from the climb, work roughened, and lifted it to his chest, pressing it over his heart. The gesture was simple, but the meaning rippled through the crowd like thunder. His silence spoke louder than any defense. "She belongs here. With me." A hush fell. Even Martha's smirk faltered. John led Nina away from the lanterns, his head high, his grip steady. They left before the first song ended, the laughter behind them fading into wind. By the time they reached the mountain path, the night had turned strange and red. The air carried a bitter tang, smoke sharp and growing. Nina stopped, heart skipping. "John," she whispered, "do you smell it?" He did. He broke into a run before she could speak again. The trail twisted upward, the glow ahead brightening into a terrible bloom. Fire. The forest was burning. They reached the clearing to find the cabin wreathed in flame. The fence was gone, the barn collapsing in sparks. The sound was alive, a roar, a scream of trees splitting in heat. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed a bucket, ran to the well, and began hauling water. "Stay back," he shouted, but Nina was already beside him, her skirt soaked, her hands blistering on the handle. The fire hissed and fought back. Smoke filled their lungs. Sparks stung their faces. Each trip to the well felt longer than the last. A burning beam crashed to the ground, throwing embers across the yard. The heat turned the air to glass. Nina stumbled, coughing, and John caught her, his arm a shield around her shoulders. "Go," he yelled over the roar. "No," she shouted back, voice raw. "Not without you." For a heartbeat they stood there, silhouetted against the blaze, two shapes refusing to surrender. Then, together, they moved again, throwing water, dragging blankets across the smoldering boards, fighting until the fire's fury began to fade into sullen smoke. By dawn, the cabin still stood, half-charred but upright, stubborn as the man who built it. The ground steamed with a memory of flame. John sank onto the steps, ash streaking his skin. Nina knelt beside him, her palms blistered, her hair tangled with soot. For a long time, they said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse. "I built this place to keep the world out." She looked at the blackened beams, the smoke curling into the pale sky. "And it came anyway." He nodded, a bitter smile tugging at his mouth. "Maybe it had to." She turned to him then, her eyes bright despite the soot. "Maybe it came to test what we're made of." He met her gaze, and the silence between them changed, no longer heavy, but full. He reached for her hand, the same hand that had fought beside him through the night, and held it like a vow. They spent the next day clearing what remained. When John rode down to town for supplies, Dust Haven greeted him with something unfamiliar. Silence not sharpened by scorn. Word of the fire had already traveled. Deputy Hollis met him outside the store, tipping his hat. "Heard you saved half the mountain," he said. John only shrugged. Didn't have much choice. The deputy's eyes softened. "Reckon you did anyway." Inside, the townsfolk parted to let him pass. Even Martha Claymore looked away, her face pale. John bought nails, flour, cloth. No one whispered this time. When he returned to the ridge, Nina was waiting by the creek, the morning sun catching in her hair. She smiled when she saw the supplies. "They're talking different now," she said quietly. "Maybe they're done talking," he replied. But they both knew the world never stays silent for long. That evening, under the scorched oak, John took her hand again. The fire had taken much, but not the wildflowers that still grew stubbornly at the edge of the clearing. He braided their stems into a ring and slipped it onto her finger. "I got no preacher," he said softly. "No papers. But I've got truth." Nina's breath trembled. "And what's that?" He looked at her, eyes dark and steady. "You're my home." Her answer was a whisper. "And you're mine." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of char and pine and new beginnings. Above them, the first stars broke through the smoke-streaked sky. Years later, folks in Dust Haven would tell the story, the mountain man and the woman who rose from dust and fire, who built their life from what the world tried to burn away. Old Eli, who remembered everything worth remembering, said he saw them once after that, walking down into town together. The people stepped aside to let them pass. Even Martha Claymore nodded, as if forgiveness had finally found her tongue. Eli said John tipped his hat to her and smiled that quiet smile of his, the one that carried both sorrow and grace. Then he turned to Nina, and they kept walking, hand in hand, down the road that led toward the horizon. On certain nights, when the wind swept down from the mountains, townsfolk swore they could smell wood smoke and wildflowers, mingled as one. And if you listened close, you could almost hear a woman's voice in the rustling leaves, saying softly, "Mercy never comes the way you expect it, but it always finds those who keep their doors open."